This is Phoenix Gaming. I'm your host, Chris. Welcome to Terrain and Me, a Beginner's Guide, Episode 2, Obscuring. Before we get into this, I just want to make a note that obscuring terrain is just another keyword, and I want to also make a note that if you don't have physical line of sight from your model to your target model, it's never considered to be within line of sight. It doesn't matter what terrain rules are in effect. It's one of those where you'll understand why I'm saying this now a little bit later on, because it's super important to remember that if you don't have actual line of sight, then you just don't have line of sight. So obscuring is just like I said, a keyword. You give it to a feature. Typically ruins have it. Rules as written, they have to have a height requirement of 5 inches. What they do is they block line of sight and visibility based on the footprint. If you think back to our woods episode, we talked about how the footprint was just a container that the terrain feature sits in. I think we called it a bucket, actually. So that's a thing to kind of keep in mind, is that it's just a bucket that the terrain feature sits in. But when you give it the obscuring keyword, that bucket now blocks line of sight. Not just the feature, the bucket. Aircraft and models with 18 or more wounds cannot benefit from obscuring. We're going to cover that later. I'm not going to dive into it yet. And then models that are within an obscuring feature are no longer obscured by that feature and can target other models that normally would be obscured by that feature, provided that they have actual line of sight. I get it. These are words. And again, I'm trying to help new players into the game. And new players are like, yeah, bro, I read that in the rule book too. Good job. You can recite some rules. Yay. But fear not, I have my really super awesome homemade visual aids to get us through this. And we're going to flash over to those in just a minute here. We're going to start with 3 examples of not having line of sight, and then we're going to finish with 1 example of having line of sight. And then from there, we'll move on to the 18 plus and aircraft rule, and then I think that'll wrap us up. So the first example of not having line of sight is going to be this one right here. We're going to break this down real quick. The gray area in the back is a footprint that represents the whole footprint of the terrain feature. Okay, so we've got this big gray square that represents our footprint. You can see the black outline. It's a U shape towards the bottom of that square. That black outline represents the actual feature itself. If you've ever seen a GW or Games Workshop tournament terrain setup, think of this as kind of like how their ruins are set up, just because it's an easy to mimic visual representation. So these will not have what you call it. They're not going to have windows or doors. We're going to assume for this that everything is just a solid piece of wood or plastic, no windows, no doors, 5 inches tall, so it can be obscuring, blah, 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 blah. Model A is going to be the orange circle. Model B is the black circle. And then we've got our super awesome line of sight cones. I really like them, I guess. I don't know. They actually seem to work. So if you look at our line of sight cones, the way I've got them set up, the blue lane that goes from model to model represents actual line of sight lines. Okay. So if you look at that, though, they pass over the black feature. The black feature would block line of sight. So because they pass over the terrain feature itself, that terrain feature would block line of sight. Now, if you look at the top portion of that, you're going to see a black stripe in the line of sight lane. Okay. That black stripe represents where the models actually would have line of sight. And the reason they would is because that black stripe doesn't pass over the feature itself. It's just empty footprint. You just pass right over it. There's nothing blocking. However, because this feature has the obscuring keyword, the whole footprint blocks line of sight. And because neither of these models are touched into the footprint, they don't have line of sight. So basically, what I'm trying to show you here is that it doesn't matter whether or not the feature is between them, because neither is touching the footprint. They just don't have line of sight. The next visual aid we're going to look at is going to be one that I see people kind of having a hard time wrap their head around, and I understand why, because it requires you to just be like, yeah, okay, this is how this works. Like, you just kind of got to suspend your disbelief a little bit. All right, so Same exact premise, same exact background. Model A is the orange model, Model B is the black model. Neither one of them is anywhere near the feature at this point. The blue line of sight lanes pass over the footprint. They don't even come close to the feature. I mean, I guess they come close, but they're not on it, obviously. But they don't have line of sight. These features just don't, or these models just don't have line of sight to each other. And again, it's because neither model is touching the footprint. And because neither model is touching the footprint and the whole line of sight lane from Model A to Model B goes over the footprint, then they just don't get to see each other. So it's kind of the same thing we just talked about. We just removed the terrain feature from between them to show that even if it was open space, as long as that footprint is there, they don't have line of sight. All right, so the last example we're going to use is this one. Here we have two models that are touched into the terrain feature. You've got the orange model on the right and the black model on the left. And then we have them both so that they're both behind the feature itself and touched into the footprint. So because they're touched into the footprint, they get to ignore obscuring, right? Yeah, right. For the purposes of that feature alone, they get to ignore obscuring. However, because that whole line of sight lane has to pass through that terrain feature, and we've already said that that terrain feature is a solid wall, then they don't have actual line of sight. So they don't get to see each other. And I bring this up because I've had a lot of people get confused and they think, well, if I'm in the obscuring feature, I just get to shoot out of it, right? Well, yeah, you do, but you still have to be able to see your target. You don't get to just be like, I'm touched into it, now I can just magically shoot my gun through walls. So you still have to be able to see your target models. And that's going to lead us into our last visual aid, and that's this one right here. Model A, the orange model, is touched into the feature, and Model B is not, but we can draw a lane of line of sight from Model A to Model B, and because that passes over the footprint but doesn't pass over the feature, and because Model A is in the feature, they can target each other. And that's all that means. So really, when it comes to obscuring, the thing to do is the first thing you need to check is, do you have line of sight of the model? If you have line of sight to the model, the next question you need to ask is either model touched into the obscuring footprint? If neither model's touched into the obscuring footprint, chances are they're not going to have line of sight to each other simply because the footprint is going to block it. Now, obviously, you got to check to see if it passes over the footprint and stuff, but this is just a good checklist to go through. If one of them is touched in and they have line of sight, then they can target each other. If neither of them are touched in, then you need to check. So, all right, so we're going to wrap this up by talking about 18 plus wounds and the aircraft keyword. So models with 18 wounds or the aircraft keyword can never benefit from obscuring terrain when it is targeted by anything. And what that means is if you have either the aircraft keyword or 18 plus wounds, I can target you no matter where you're at on the board. Now I still have to be able to see you, but I can still just target you. Units that those models target still benefit from obscuring. So if aircraft wanted to shoot me, but I was behind an obscuring footprint and that aircraft wasn't touched into it, I still get to claim the benefit of being obscured by that footprint. And the way I like to kind of describe that to people when I'm trying to teach them is I'm like, you got to think of it as like a one-way mirror. I get to see you, but you don't get to see me because of the way it interacts. But no matter what, like I said, you have to have actual line of sight. If you do not have actual line of sight, the model is never considered to be within line of sight. So you can't target the aircraft or the model with 18 wounds if you can't see it from the perspective of your models. So these are just things to keep in mind. And that's going to wrap up our video on obscuring. I hope I did a great job breaking that down for everybody. Be sure to like and subscribe, leave comments, questions. Like I said, our next couple videos, we're going to wrap up on some orc stuff, and we're going to touch on some fight phase stuff. I'd like to think I'm pretty good at the fight phase, so I really feel like it's an area I could help people. But we're gonna start with some of the more difficult aspects of it first, and then get easier as we go. Thanks a lot. Again, you can find me on Patreon, patreon.com, Phoenix Gaming Space, Twitter at 2NerdsChris, and then I'll get my Facebook page added on the next video. Thanks.